Happy Friday. It is time for the MLB Strategy Show right here at Awesemo.com. Of course, I am Jason. That is Greg, man. Greg, how you doing this Friday morning, man?
Not too bad. We got football finally started. I know it's going to be a big weekend for you, too. And then still baseball slate, but a weird start time for baseball, which I was saying before. Like, I didn't even realize until I was reserving my lineup for before we started. It's like 8 o'clock start for, like, no reason really whatsoever. Baseball's just like, hey, game start an hour later on Friday.
Yeah, when I started the prep last night for the Early Bird podcast, I'm like, hold on. I'm like, I first went to the MLB app, like, let me write down the games, starting pitchers, things along those lines, and I'm just like, whoa, is the main slate 8? And I go to DraftKings, go to FanDuel, go to Yahoo. I'm like, yeah, we've got an 8:05 main slate East Coast time. You know, it's So MLB Live Before Lock Me today at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So you gotta check out that right here on Awesemo.com. Of course, we are sponsored by Yahoo. Let's talk about what happened last night in Major League Baseball. Some of the notable items I put out there. Mookie Betts starting at second base, and the MLB article on this one said that this was kind of like a side deal during his negotiations for his extension with the Dodgers.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, especially from a fantasy standpoint, because if he ends up getting second base / outfield eligibility on DraftKings, like that's totally different. That gives Mookie Betts way more flexibility, and it gives Dodgers stacks a lot more flexibility. And already they're a team with a decent amount of flexibility because Cody Bellinger is first base and outfield eligible. Max Muncy is, I think, first and third base eligible. And they have a lot of guys who move around and play multiple positions. So now we're going to have a situation going forward where it looks like we're going to have Dodgers stacks. And they're already a team that's projected to have like one of the highest run totals of every single slate. And now it's going to be a thing where it's like you could play most Dodgers guys in like any position you want. And it's going to make it even easier to stack them as long as there's value pitchers on a slate.
Yeah, I mean, obviously in season-long fantasy leagues, typically 10 games is typically what it takes to get second base eligibility. I mean, look, the odds of Mookie Betts getting 10 games over the next week and a half is unlikely, but definitely something you got to monitor there with Mookie Betts and the Dodgers. Some other things from last night. Bray Singer had a no-hitter in the 8th inning, the Royals prospect. Great performance to him, had 8 strikeouts in that game. Freddie Freeman hit 2 home runs. And Dylan Bundy, man, if you had him last night, 12 Ks and 7 1/3.
Yeah, it's pretty funny because Bundy has been really good this year. Other than like 3 starts ago, he pitched against the Mariners and just kind of sucked. And his velocity was way down in that start. He had like an 88 average velocity on his fastball. And I'm starting to think like, oh, is something wrong with Dylan Bundy? Is he going to start to regress a little bit? And then, no, that's not the case. He's been terrific ever since then. So just one outlier start. And those kind of weird things happen sometimes. Like we had Chris Paddock last night, sprained an ankle, and his fastball velocity dipped from like 94 to 90 miles per hour, and then he came out after 2 innings. But at least it was only an ankle injury. It's not anything arm-related.
Yeah, just kind of looking at some of the various things last night. Drew Smyly comes in as the second pitcher, throws 4 innings, gets 8 strikeouts. That was something as I was kind of going through the box scores that stuck out to me too.
Yeah, we haven't had very many of those good kind of long reliever type performances. There was a lot of them the last couple of years, especially with the Rays, where there'd be, an opener come in and pitch 1 inning, and then you have somebody like Ryan Yarbrough or something like that who'd be, a viable DFS play who'd be close to min price, would pitch like 4 or 5 innings, and we'd be trying to guess a lot of times who that long reliever is going to be. We haven't really had many of those situations so far this year, but yeah, there was one with Drew Smyly last night.
I have a feeling we're going to touch on that when we're talking about the Rangers game later on today, with Jordan Lyles expected to be pitcher number 2 in that game. He's only available on DraftKings, but I know that's something we'll definitely talk about as we go on here with the MLB Strategy Show. Of course, if you do have any questions, comments, be sure to hit those up right there in the YouTube chat or in the premium Slack channel. If you do it in Slack, just mention me so I make sure that I do see it. But we did mention main slate does start at 8:05 Eastern. Really, we've got a bunch of several doubleheader games in terms of this slate today. The Orioles and the Yankees are playing 2 games. The Phillies and the Marlins are also playing 2 games. We have 2 games in the 6 p.m. Eastern time hour. No games in the 7 o'clock Eastern time hour. That's really weird to see. But yes, main slate, 9-game slate here, 8:05. Going to kick off with the Pirates and the Royals. Steven Baralt going for the Pirates, and Chris Bubik going for the Royals. And Bubik was a guy that myself and Adam talked a lot about last night on the Early Bird podcast, of just looking at his salary in terms of this one, particularly on DraftKings at 6,600 as an SP2 option.
Yeah, I mean, he's okay. I mean, he's not my favorite SP2 option, because actually somebody who we liked, I think it was last week when we did this show together, is we've used Kikuchi, who's also a viable option at a really cheap price. So certainly prefer him. 6,600 for Bubek against the Pirates. It's an easy matchup, and the price, like you said, is decent. And because there's a Coors Field game, we're going to need salary savings at pitcher somewhere. So I don't mind him. Not necessarily a high priority play for me. He hasn't pitched particularly well this year. Hasn't been awful either. But for the salary, I just kind of look at it. It's kind of like whatever. It makes sense, but not necessarily somebody I'm enthusiastic about playing. But he probably gets forced in my lineups a little bit just because of the outlook of the slate.
So we've got a pair of lefties starting this matchup. So let's look at some right-handed bats in terms of, let's start off with, I guess we'll start with the Royals, because I don't think anyone's ever, pretty much targeting the Pirates very often at all. But let's talk about those Royals right-handed bats of what do you like there?
Well, one thing though, just pointing on the Pirates, is if you do want to go, really contrarian with a cheap stack, the Pirates are really inexpensive. And they do have a 9% chance of being the highest value stack in our projections. So if there is a lineup you want to make where it's like, hey, I want to pay up for two pitchers, I want to go for Shane Bieber and Lucas Giolito, and just do it in a way that nobody else is going to do it, I think the Pirates do make a little bit of sense there. If we look at some of the right-handed bats from the Royals, Hunter Dozier, I think 3,800 makes some sense. If Ryan McBroom is in the starting lineup, he's min price. He's only 2,000, so that's going to be a good one-off salary saving type play. He's the guy who stands out the most to me on the roster. Obviously the Pirates bats, we mentioned about they're never really. You kind of mentioned there about, hey, you want to go contrarian. I mean, look, there's not going to be people targeting the Pirates bats, but is there something in that lineup that does intrigue you? I would say Stallings a catcher at 3,000 if I had to pick one guy that I'm most interested in, just because he's cheap, he's that catcher. He's actually a reasonable hitter for a catcher. And just, it's a position that's so difficult to get fantasy production out of anyway, that I just generally tend to look for cheaper cheaper catchers, just because it's a good position to save salary at. Chances are you're not going to get production out of your catcher anyway. So you might as well go with a cheap one.
One of the just looking at the ownership that we have on this game in terms of the hitting inside of this. Look at everyone's under 20% ownership. Hunter Dozier is someone that's a little over 10% ownership, and that's someone that Adam had thrown out there about a bat on the Royals side.
Yeah, I don't mind Hunter Dozier. He has power upside, which is pretty rare to find in the Royals lineup. The three guys that have there's four guys that have like a medium amount of upside, and that's Whit Merrifield, because he's actually the one player in the lineup that's a good hitter. Hunter Dozier has a little bit of power upside, as does Maikel Franco. And if you go down the lineup, there's Alberto Monteci, who's been a massive disappointment for fantasy this year. He was a guy who was taken, at the top of yearly league drafts this year, and mostly because of his speed upside, right? He gets on base, and he was an overwhelming favorite to lead the league in stolen bases this year at sportsbooks. But the issue is you can't steal base if you don't get on base. And that's kind of where Alberto Monteci is at this year, is he just never gets on base. He doesn't make a lot of contact, doesn't draw walks, and that just makes it really difficult to steal base if you're never on base. But he still has that upside where he's not going to have a zero on base percentage for the year. And when he does get on base, he's typically running. So we see it maybe once a week or so where Monteci is upside just because he gets on base once he steals a base or two and scores a run. And then it's like, hey, Alberto Monteci had a good fantasy game at 1% ownership or whatever he ends up being. So I think that he's not a terrible one-off either. But I do agree with what you said, that Adam said about Hunter Dozier, is he is probably the one player with the most legitimate upside on the offense.
The good old Billy Hamilton rule. Can't steal base, you don't get on. And, well, we know the struggle. Like, it was like the other day I saw, what was it, the Cubs signed him? I want to say it was.
He's been on a few teams. It's funny, too, because there's times I'm watching a baseball game, especially the last couple of years, where it's all of a sudden like Billy Hamilton comes in to pinch run. It's like, oh, this is where Billy Hamilton is now. Because that's really what he is at this point in his career, is he's just a pinch runner. I mean, there was a point in time where he was like a top 20 or so prospect, just because of the idea where it's like he's going to be good on defense. And it's like if he ever figures out how to get on base, he's just going to steal a million bags, and he just never learned to get on base. And it seems like Monteci could be following in those footsteps.
Yeah. Next up, we've got the A's and the Rangers. Mike Friars going for the Athletics. Luis Garcia and the opener role going for the Rangers is expected. Jordan Lyles will go in after him. Mike Friars over on Yahoo is $34. Of course, this show is sponsored by Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports, which they now include CSV upload and CSV edit features when you're looking to play those multiple lines. Make better choices. Choose Yahoo Daily Fantasy. Of course, you got to go over there and check out some of those contests that they have for tonight's matchups. Mike Friars at $34. Garcia, I mean, you can't really play him at $25. But I think the interesting part of this was, how will Jordan Lyles' ownership look like on DraftKings at 6,400?
Yeah, I don't really think people are going to roster him for a couple of reasons. Number one, there's always still that little bit of a crapshoot type thing where even though somebody's expected to come into the game as a long reliever, it's never really a guarantee, right? I mean, there's been times like earlier we mentioned the Rays situation with like Ryan Yarbrough. There was times last year where Yarbrough was like 20% owned because he was expected to be the long reliever in a favorable situation, and then he just didn't enter the game. So I think we look at today, 6,400, even though the price tag is cheap. I mean, there's Yusuke Kikuchi, who's cheaper and is a better pitcher and is better chance at upside. So I don't really like Lyles all that much. It's also a tough matchup because the Oakland A's have a really good offense. As for Mike Fiers as a pitcher, even in a plus matchup against the Rangers, I can't consider Mike Fiers. The 7,200 isn't all that cheap a price tag. We consider that he gives up a lot of runs and doesn't strike anybody out. 5.36 strikeouts per 9 innings for Fiers so far this year, and then a 4.93 ERA to go along with a 5.3 FIP. So Fiers, not only is he not good, he's not good from a fantasy perspective either. So none of the pitchers here do I have a lot of interest in.
In terms of the bats in this game, let's start on the Rangers side. And the simple question, I probably ask this question every time. Outside of Joey Gallo, what do you like?
Yeah, I like Tavares has been leading off for the Rangers, and he's still super cheap. He hasn't really been priced up yet, even though he's taken over the leadoff role. He's only 2,300 on DraftKings. There was a slate, 2 days ago now, where he batted leadoff. He was 2,100, and he scored like 20 fantasy points. He stole like 3 bases. He had an extra base hit. So to me, it looks like he is a potential fantasy-friendly game. But then more than anything, he's leading off in a favorable matchup, and he's almost min price. So you look at a slate where there's some high-end pitchers we want to roster. There's a Coors Field game. We need to find value somewhere, and just when you have somebody in a prime lineup spot that's only 2,300, it's pretty easy to justify putting him into lineups.
Yeah, just decided to kind of pull up some of the FanDuel numbers on this one. You know, Matt Olson, 3,300.
Yeah, I have it up right here.
Gallo, 3,400.
So Tavares is a little more expensive on FanDuel. He's 2,900. But somebody else at the top of the order that makes more sense on FanDuel than they do on DraftKings is Rougned Odor, who's probably going to be batting second for the Rangers against a righty. He's only 2,400 on FanDuel. So if you're looking for a plug-in for cheap, that's where I would roster Odor. Tavares is more of a DraftKings specific play just because of the big difference in prices. Yeah. 2,300 on DraftKings versus 2,900 on FanDuel. That's also something else that signifies that there's a pretty good amount of value on Tavares in his DraftKings price.
Anything else from the hitting side you want to touch on this one before we move on?
No, not really. Just some of those one-offs from the Rangers. I don't have interest in the Oakland offense really. They're fairly expensive, and there's just other high-end offenses that we're going to want to target tonight.
Obviously, the best pitching matchup of the night is the Indians and the Twins. Shane Bieber on the hill for the Indians. We all know what he's done here, and Maeda going for the Twins as well. Obviously, both high-price options here on DK. Bieber, 11,000. Maeda, 10,200. And then 9,500 for him on FanDuel, and then 11,600 on FanDuel. $61 for Shane Bieber on Yahoo. I mean, look, what more can you say about what he has been able to do here this year? I mean, 6 out of 9 starts, he's had at least 10 strikeouts. He's been an absolute stud on all platforms this year. I think the question with this one is more about how do you build your lineup with a Shane Bieber at 11,000 if you want to go that way.
Yeah, so I mean, the other thing we have to talk about too, there's a 50% chance of rain in Minnesota tonight. So that adds a whole nother wrinkle to the slate where I mean, if Bieber's in there, you want to get exposure to him, but then it's also an opportunity cost situation where it's, do you like the Coors game more or do you like the expensive pitchers more? I generally lean towards the expensive pitchers, but I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do tonight just because we have that chance of rain in there, 50%. We've seen, what I feel like is more games get canceled for rain than usual this year. So that's always something I'm a little wary of. And I don't know. It just changes the outlook of the slate so much. It's a thing where we have to see later in the day what the weather situation looks like. Because if there is enough rain there that I'm going to want to fade, that's going to mean I get a lot more exposure to the Coors Field game. The weather situation here is such a massive. It just has such a big, just sway on where we're going to want to roster our pitchers and whatnot. Because, like you said, it's impossible to get away from Bieber if he's starting and there's no risk. Because even in a tough matchup, he scores 35 fantasy points every start, no matter how good the offense is, because he strikes everybody out. Yeah.
By the way, should note that today's free premium content at Awesemo.com is the MLB top pitchers, where you want to look and say, look at, Bieber, Giolito, Maeda, Castillo, some of those top options there. Obviously, you mentioned about the weather concern, but, we talked about the pitching here. Maeda, I think the only concern would be is how many pitches does he throw? Can he get above 90? I mean, are we kind of limited in potentially what he could score based on how long he can go?
So the issue I have with Maeda is just the other options on the slate. He's 10,200 on DraftKings, and if we look at the other high-end pitchers, I prefer Bieber. I prefer Giolito. So just because of those guys, Maeda comes in a distant third amongst the high-end options. So assuming that there was no weather concern in the Twins-Indians game, I would have some exposure to Maeda, except not as much as I would have to those other two top-end guys.
In terms of the hitting on this one, let's start with the Indians side of things. What sticks out to you?
Nothing. I think it's pretty easy to just avoid the offense in this game. Pretty big slate. We've got, 9 games to choose from. So just considering that we have two, really good starting pitchers, I think it's easy enough to just avoid the offenses and look elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at our top stack tool, neither one of these teams are up there in terms of ownership shares.
No, nor are they up there in terms of chances to put up a big performance tonight. We have Twins 1% chance to be the top stack, and the Indians 2% chance. And both of them projected for literally almost 0% ownership as a stack. It's 0.1 and 0.2%. People will be going elsewhere. I will say this: if you play 150 lineups and you make one Indian stack and one Twin stack, you're 10x the field on ownership on them based on what it's projected for right now.
Yeah, that's something to, unless they go do an Atlanta Braves and throw up a 29-run spot on you. And if you don't have those bats in your lineup, you're pretty much screwed.
Dude, that was a really funny slate because I was really high on the Rangers that night. That was the Tavares night also. Where any other slate, that would have been a great stack because the Rangers, almost all the players like Min Price, they scored 7 runs that night, and they were still nowhere near the top of the slate because the Braves scored 1 million runs. So there was a really funny dichotomy if you looked at the breakdown of just the scores overall for the slate, because the Braves were fairly low owned that night. So it was just the very small percentage of lineups scored 280 fantasy points. And then there was a next tier of lineups. There's 180 fantasy points. Whereas those lineups did well, except they were 100 points out of first place.
Yeah, I mean, if you didn't have Adam Duvall, I think he scored 88 points on FanDuel.
A lot. It was a lot. He scored because he had 3 homers and 9 RBIs.
Yeah, I want to say in the big GPP on FanDuel, it was 370. I want to say. Yeah,
it was the highest scoring slate that I could ever remember. That, and there was also a bunch of pitchers that did really well that night.
Yeah, that was I just remember I didn't have any Braves. I looked at it, said, well, no reason to even look at it, so no reason to look up there.
That's one of the ones you just start looking to tomorrow's slate ahead of time.
Yeah. We just move on. But moving on, we got the Tigers and the White Sox. Obviously, when you talk about top pitching, on this slate, and maybe if you kind of want to go away from the Indians and Twins game, this has probably got to be a spot you look at with Lucas here.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, not only has he pitched really well over the last handful of starts, he got off to a kind of rough start this season where some of his old issues with control started to pop back up, but he's got it back together, especially ever since he pitched that no-hitter. The Tigers also present a really easy matchup. Let's see, against right-handed pitching, 86 WRC plus. Tigers have a 28.3% strikeout rate, so the highest strikeout rate against right-handed pitching of any team in baseball. So you just put that together with, a bona fide ace in Lucas Giolito on the mound. And the question with Giolito is not really, do you want to roster him or not? Because I think that's a pretty easy yes. The question is, how much of him do you want to roster, and how does he stack up to Kenta Maeda and Shane Bieber? And to me, right now, I have Giolito 1 just because of the weather concerns with the other game. If the weather is not a concern, I go Bieber 1, Giolito 2, and Maeda 3. But right now, just because there's some uncertainty with the rain and what's going to happen in the Twins-Indians game, I have Giolito as the guy who I'm probably going to have the most exposure to as of this morning.
Well, you're not the only one who's looking at that, because just looking at ownership projections, he is by far the highest owned pitcher on tonight's slate.
Yeah, Bieber isn't that far behind him, though. I mean, we've got 55% projected ownership for Giolito and 48% for Bieber. So both of them are going to be pretty popular. It's hard to get away from them. It does feel like it's a situation where you're picking one or the other. And right now I'm going to lean towards Giolito, and that'll change if the weather clears up.
Oh, no doubt. Yeah, that's something to look at in terms of on the other, on the Detroit Bats. Kind of break it down for us.
I don't have interest in the Detroit Bats, and I've actually been on the Tigers a decent amount over the last couple weeks or so because there's been a lot of slates that have been really cheap. It's funny because they've hit reasonably well as of late, especially against left-handed pitching. So what's happened now is their prices for this slate are the most expensive they've been, I think, all season. And for a matchup against Giolito, which is one of the toughest matchups they've had all year. So, I mean, they've had these really easy matchups lately. Like they went up against Rich Hill on Sunday, and everybody was like 2,800 and below. And now they're going up against Giolito, and Scope is 4,200. Miguel Cabrera's gotten up to, well, he's still pretty cheap at 3,200, but Victor Reyes 3,900 now. So these guys are all like $500 to $800 more expensive for a much more difficult matchup. So it's pretty easy to avoid them going up against Giolito.
Now, of course, if you'll go check out the content we have over at Awesemo.com, Terry's got his stacks article and home run article already up there, and he mentions about a White Sox stack of a 9, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, I mean, Casey Mize is one of the top pitching prospects in baseball. Doesn't look ready yet for the major leagues. The stuff is still decent, but it's just not leading to results as of yet. So it looks like he's somebody who's we're going to want to target against. The White Sox have a pretty high implied run total on the slate. The one question I have here, though, is just the price tags here on the White Sox. They're so high, and if I'm going for an expensive offense, I'd rather just go to Coors Field. And then also, if you're rostering them, it's hard to roster some of the expensive pitchers because, I mean, these guys have comparable prices to the Coors Field players. We got Tim Anderson's 5,700, Moncada 53, Grandal 53, Abreu 55, Eloy Jimenez 51. Like there just aren't cheap bats here. The only guys who are priced below 4,800 in the entire lineup are Nomar Mazar at 3,300, and then we've got Madrigal at 3,200 hitting 9. And it's hard to really be thrilled about either of their upside. If I had to roster one of those cheap guys, it would be Mazar at 3,300. I don't think he makes for an awful one-off. But overall, I just look at the White Sox offense, and even though it's a good spot for them, I think there's just other places I prefer to go because of those price tags.
Yeah, I mean, there's a price tag, but I guess on the other side of the equation would be is if you're, I mean, we're all expecting that, the game in Coors is going to be highly owned on both sides of the equation in that one. So if you're looking for, to go against the ownership and you can fit it in, but I mean, you bring up a great point of if you like these top end pitchers and you're trying to rostering them with a White Sox stack is pretty difficult.
Yeah, a lot of it's just about opportunity cost. And I generally tend towards rostering the more expensive pitchers. But like we said, that's a little bit in flux right now because two of the best pitchers on the slate are in a game that could end up being rained out. So that's going to, it's going to make a big difference in who I'm looking to roster tonight. As for the White Sox and being a potential leverage stack, I mean, there is reason to look at our ownership and our top stack tool and think that there is a little bit of reason to like them at least more than the field. The White Sox have a 5% chance to be the top scoring team on the slate and only 2% projected ownership. So I think at only 2% projected ownership, I mean, it's not that hard to just, you make a couple of twin stacks and it's like, hey, I have more than the field just because they're projected to have such low ownership. Per dollar, though, I still prefer the Coors Field game.
Next up, we got the Cubs and the Brewers. John Lester on the hill for the Cubbies. Brandon Woodruff on the mound for the Brewers. Look, I said this on the Earlier Bird podcast. I can never really see myself rostering John Lester in DFS. And like I think Adam's line was he's priced on DraftKings like it's 2009. He's pitching for the Red Sox.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's priced just for name value, right? I mean, people still look at the John Lester name, and we see that sometimes too, where there's a hitter that's had, I can't even think of who this would be off the top of my head right now, but we've seen it all the time where there's a hitter who's struggling. But it's like, oh, well, this guy hit 40 home runs in 2013, therefore he remains expensive on DraftKings. And that's the treatment that John Lester's getting. I mean, Lester is a 5.8 ERA, a 5.61 FIP this year. He doesn't get strikeouts anymore. The velocity is way down. His velocity is at, 89 miles per hour is his average fastball velocity. First year of his career that he's been below 90 in terms of average fastball velocity. It's been a steady decline. 2015, he was at 92 miles per hour. That was kind of when it first started the decline. And he's gone down by, a few tenths of a mile per hour every year since then. And we're finally at a point in his career where it just looks like it's not usable for him anymore. Like he can't get hitters out with his fastball. And it's becoming such a big issue. In the past, it's kind of hard to know what was going on with Lester because he's somebody who I've targeted a decent amount against the last couple of years. And he's kind of just found success regardless of his stuff declining. And the peripheral numbers always suggest that he was a much worse starting pitcher than how he was actually performing. But it's hard to know, was he just getting lucky for the last couple of years, or was there something that he was doing that was kind of allowing him to outperform his peripherals? But either way, it's all coming apart now. And the benefit we have here is not only is Lester really expensive, the Brewers are really inexpensive because of that. So outside of Keston Hiura and Christian Yelich, who are each 5,300, everybody else is below 4,000. And I think the Brewers make for a really good value stack on this slate.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the two top ends for the Brewers bats. I mean, obviously we'll have to see what the lineup looks like, but is there maybe is it someone like Avisel Garcia, who's typically in that sixth spot, that's going to be kind of maybe a core component of a stack? Yeah,
I like Garcia a lot at 2,700. Ryan Braun's always tough because he's in and out of the lineup so much. And then even when he's in the lineup, it seems like 40% of the time he gets hurt in warmups, then ends up getting pulled out of the lineup. But he's 3,500. He makes sense. Jed Jerko, who has multi-positional eligibility, he's 3,900. There's a lot of cheap bats here that I think stand out and make sense for a stack. And I have more interest in Hiura than in Yelich at the 5,300 price tag. Yelich has struggled a little bit this year, and I still think that he's viable, but it's just starting to become a little difficult for me to justify paying such an expensive price tag for him. I think I'd rather go with 5 other Brewers and then plug in one of the expensive bats from the Coors game with the Brewers stack than just roster Yelich.
How about the Cubs bats?
So I kind of like Brandon Woodruff in general, so that's going to have me off of the Cubs. They're also a team that's relatively expensive. If I had to pick one-off hitter, it would be Kyle Schwarber just for the home run upside. He's somebody who could go deep against pretty much anybody. But or else, almost everybody in the Cubs lineup actually is like 4,600. We've got Bryant, Baez, Contreras, and Rizzo, all 4,600. Haps 4,600. Oh, no, Rizzo's actually 4,900. But either way, for whatever reason, DraftKings just looked at the Cubs lineup. They're like, hey, 4,600 everybody today. So I think just to match up against Brandon Woodruff's a little bit too difficult for me to want to roster the Cubs offense today.
Of course, if you do have any questions on these games, be sure to hit those up right there in the YouTube chat. David, awesome that we were helping you yesterday take down a slate there in a throwdown contest. Appreciate and of course, look, be sure to hit that thumbs up button here. And if you're not subscribed to the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button because we got a ton of content today. Got several NFL shows. We've got NBA Live Before Lock, MLB Live Before Lock, so be sure to check out all the program we have over here today. Of course, if you do want to sign up for a Awesemo Plus MLB Weekly Pass, you can do that right now by going to awesemo.com/join and sign up for a weekly pass for $15.95. That'll get you access to our ownership projections, player projections, the all-new Top Pitchers tool. And you can see up on the screen right now, Jordan putting up some of the testimonials of people who've been able to take advantage of these tools and how it's worked for them. So give it a shot today. Sign up for that weekly pass for $15.95. All you got to do is go to awesemo.com/join to sign up for an MLB weekly pass. Next up, we've got the Reds and the Cardinals. Adam Wainwright on the hill for the Cardinals. Luis Castillo on the mound for the Reds. Before we get into the pitching matchup in terms of this, Garrett had asked this question. He says, why are the Cardinals bats so expensive on DraftKings?
Yeah, it is pretty weird. Luis Castillo's been super inconsistent this year. I mean, if you just look at his last handful of starts, 16 DraftKings points, 9 DraftKings points, 24, 13, 24. So I don't actually believe in, hey, it means he's due for a bad start or anything like that. It just means he's been inconsistent this year. He could be good. He could be kind of crap, right? Maybe sometimes good, maybe sometimes not. That's kind of what Luis Castillo's been this year. At 9,800 on DraftKings, there's other high-end pitchers that I prefer on the slate, so I don't really want to roster him. But by the same merit, he's been good enough to where I don't really want to roster the Cardinals bats either. And then as for the price tags, they're ridiculously expensive. Cole Wong, 4,900, Edman, 52, Goldschmidt, 56, Brad Miller, 5,000. I don't know why they're so expensive. Maybe there was a starting pitcher change that I don't remember. Like maybe Luis Castillo was not originally expected to start when the pricing came out. But yeah, I agree. The pricing really makes no sense here. I think the Cardinals make for a very easy team to fade.
23% ownership that we have on Luis Castillo. Because, it's obviously, I wonder if someone is looking to build a lineup. Let's just say maybe they're a single entry player. And all of a sudden they're going through and they see Luis Castillo, 9,800, but he's 1-5. Like I look at that, I wonder, is that something we can leverage for ourselves?
The price tag's just it's just too steep for me. And then, like you said, the projected ownership at 24%, that's pretty high for a guy who's expensive in a not easy matchup. The Cardinals have had a decent offense this year. And the other thing too is just, there's other pitchers that are up there. Like we have Maeda and Bieber, assuming the weather's okay there. We have Giolito, who I much prefer to Castillo in this matchup. So there's just other guys that I have ahead of him. I don't think Castillo is going to be in my player pool. If he is in my player pool, then it means there's probably a weather concern that ends up being holding through to lock. And even if he is, I can't imagine I'm going to roster more than 8% or something like that of Castillo.
In terms of, are you going to target either side of the bats in this game in terms of stacks?
Certainly not the Cardinals for their price. I don't mind some of the lefties on the Reds. One thing that's weird about the Cardinals' price is not only are the batters really expensive, Adam Wainwright's 8,800 on DraftKings, so that's equally ridiculous. I think the lefties have a decent chance to get to him. Joey Votto at 3,900. I understand he hasn't been great this year, but still 3,900 at the top of the order in what I assume is going to be a pretty easy matchup against Adam Wainwright. That's viable. Jesse Winker's had a great year, 3,500. Winker's a guy who just has been priced up really at all this year on DraftKings, and he always makes sense against weaker right-handed pitchers because Jesse Winker has, a dozen home runs for the year. He's close to the league lead in home runs. So I think that he's somebody with a ton of upside for his price tag. He's going to be one of my favorite one-off plays on the slate.
Yeah, just looking over on the FanDuel side of things at ownership, Castillo just about 13% ownership, and Adam Wainwright.
Very low. Let's see, bring him up here.
Am I just not seeing him? Yeah, as 8,700, FanDuel, when you're talking about a one-pitcher slate, because you have to imagine that everyone's going to look at those top three. Obviously, we're going to see about the weather concerns and then that could, if there's some reason Cleveland, Minnesota doesn't happen tonight, Lucas's ownership on FanDuel is going to be insane.
Yeah, and same on DraftKings. I think because the other thing too with Giolito is even though he's expensive, there's cheaper pitchers to like tonight. I've mentioned Kikuchi. Caleb Smith is going to be a viable option also tonight on DraftKings at 5,900. So it looks like it's going to be viable. Like you can make 5-man. I've actually made it also on DraftKings. You can make 5-3, 4-4 stacks of just the Coors Field game with players from both sides with Kikuchi and Giolito as the starting pitchers, and it fits together. Mm-hmm. So just for that reason, I think that especially if those high end guys, if Maeda and Bieber don't become viable options, then Giolito, because he could just fit into lineups with anybody because there's cheap enough SP2s, then, yeah, I mean, we could see a situation where he's like 65% or something like that.
Yeah, that's where for our premium members, if you have Fantasy Cruncher as a part of your account, that's where that's how I love to use Fantasy Cruncher in MLB is like, let me start kind of figuring out some pitching combinations, and then let me see what I can fit in. And sometimes you might be surprised what you can fit into your roster.
Yeah, for sure. And it always depends on just what cheap starting pitchers are available. That's what so many slates come down to is there a cheap starting pitcher that has legitimate upside? And then is there a Coors Field game or not? And then how do the pieces fit together? And for today, it looks like you could get pretty easily an ace, a cheap starting pitcher, and then a Coors Field stack. So this is especially because there's one particular bat in Coors Field that we'll talk about later who's just grossly mispriced.
Well, that's the game we got next here. Coors Field, the Angels and the Rockies. Marquez on the mound for the Rockies and Canning on the hill for the Angels. So, obviously, this is going to be a game that everyone's going to be looking at stacking. And, of course, obviously, it comes down to pricing of, how you're going to fit these into your rosters. So let's get right into the bats. I mean, obviously, not exactly a game where you're going to look at the pitching. So let's talk about the bats here, man. Break it down for us.
All right, so the first thing we have to talk about is David Dowell, who's projected for like 160% ownership or something ridiculous like that, because the Rockies have by far the highest implied run total of the slate. Griffin Canning was really good last year. He's dealing with an elbow injury and he's pitching through it. And the early indications seem to be that he shouldn't be pitching through it because he's not performing well and his velocity's down. So it's really weird to me that the Angels are taking one of the top young pitchers in the organization. They've already diagnosed him with a UCL injury. And they're just saying like, hey, we don't think it needs surgery right now. So we're just going to let him pitch through it. And then it's like, he's not pitching well. The velocity's down. I just don't understand why he's out on the mound. But as long as this is the case, we're probably going to want to roster batters against him more often than not, especially at Coors Field. And then the guy I was alluding to before. So David Dowell hasn't played since August 17th was the last time that he was in the lineup. He's been dealing with a back injury. But he was reinstated from the injured list, and I assume he's going to be in the lineup because of that. The pricing algorithm is not caught up, so $2,800 for David Dowell is going to make him just the highest owned batter on the slate by far, maybe even the highest owned batter we've seen on any slate outside of like a 2 or 3 game slate or something. For a full slate, as long as David Dowell's in the lineup, he's definitely going to be the chalkiest bat we've seen, and it's hard to argue with it, right? The Rockies have like a 6.5 implied run total. David Dowell is really cheap. We need some value bats. He makes a ton of sense. I'm not going to lock him in or anything like that because I don't think it makes sense to go like 100% on any one hitter if you're playing a ton of lineups because there's so much variance with the offense. But I think it makes sense to go even with the field with Dowell and get something, like 35 to 40% or whatever he ends up being because it's just such an outrageous value play for a hitter.
Yeah, 2,800 on DK, 3,000 on FanDuel. Yeah, I mean everyone's gonna pop them in their lineup, and that's something that as the day goes on, we just kind of watch of what is that ownership way, and then when you're doing your crunches and you're putting your lineup, see what that crunches are coming out. Make sure to kind of how much exposure do you want to him? I think is really the big question if you're playing 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 and up lineups.
Yeah, for me, it's just going to probably be whatever ends up, whatever the field ends up being. And then the other thing, too, is, you look at the Rockies lineup, there's other hitters that are fairly cheap. Outside of, we have the big 3 for them who are all expensive, Story, Blackman, and Arenado. But outside of them, Tapia's 3,700. He's been a viable fantasy option leading off. Kevin Pillar's 3,800. Matt Kemp is 3,600. Now, of those 3, it stands to reason one of them is not going to be in the lineup if David Dowell is in the lineup. So that's kind of to be seen. My gut feeling is that it's probably going to be Kemp who gets left out of the lineup, but that's just a guess right now. And then you move down the lineup, Ryan McMahon, he is some power upside. He's only 3,900. So I think it makes a whole lot of sense that you could roster, 1 or 2 of the Story, Blackman, Arenado, and then you stack the rest of the Colorado bats and you have enough leftover salary to go with Giolito and then one of the cheap pitchers.
What about an Angel stack?
Yeah, so I like the Angels too. I just don't like them quite as much as the Rockies, mostly because I think German Marquez is a much better pitcher than Griffin Canning. Marquez has had his struggles at Coors Field at times, but he also has really good stuff. So we've seen him find success in Denver from time to time. Still, I think you look at, how do you get away from like Trout at Coors Field, right? If you could only pay up for one bat on this entire slate, to me, Trout would be the guy. Is he in the league for home runs now? If not,
I believe so.
second.
I believe I saw it last night, 16.
So Trout, and you put Trout, who's probably the best player in baseball, the league leader in home runs right now, put him in Coors Field. It's pretty obvious that you could pay up for him if you find the salary. Other Angels hitters that I think make some sense. If you want to take Joe Adell as a one-off, he's 2,500 on DraftKings, and he's a guy, boom or bust option, but a ton of power upside. And I think you just put a young power bat, one of the top hitting prospects in baseball, in Coors Field. I think he has a chance to hit a home run, maybe even two in this spot. And he never has that much ownership, but he's somebody who I think is like a plug-in who's going to have like 1% to 2% ownership that has home run upside and is worth rostering for that.
Yeah, I just started a dummy crunch, putting no factors into it, no exposures, absolutely nothing at all. And it is filled with Angels and Rockies.
Yeah, it's weird because outside of those top bats, the other guys are so cheap. And we see a lot where Coors Field, even though some of these peripheral hitters maybe aren't great, like we'll just see guys like Ryan McMahon or, like Walsh on the Angels, like those guys will just get priced up, usually like 47 or 4,800, just because it's Coors Field and everybody gets priced up. And for some reason, that's just not the case tonight.
Yeah, just kind of looking at a lot of Mike Trout, obviously a lot of David Dowell. A guy we'll talk about a little bit, I think could be interesting, Caleb Smith on the mound for the D-backs, first, making his D-backs debut after COVID. So that's, but yeah, it is a lot of Rockies. Kevin Pillar coming up a lot in lineups as well.
Yeah, only 3,800. He makes a lot of sense on DraftKings. I guess just the real question, like I said before, is if Dowell's in the lineup, who loses out on their starting spot? I said I think it's probably going to be Matt Kemp. I think it's probably going to be Platoon. I'm assuming that going forward, Kemp is going to be in the lineup against left-handed pitching, and David Dahl is going to be in the lineup against right-handed pitching, and then one of them is going to get injured in about 2 weeks, and then they'll have to play every day.
Would you agree with what 3 Run Shot had to say? The Angels are just too cheap in Coors?
Oh, 100%. And the same goes for the Rockies also. I slightly prefer the Rocky side of the game, but both of them are much too cheap. They're going to be popular, but for good reason. And just because of the price tags, there's not some crazy opportunity cost like there usually is with stacking Coors Field. So with that said, I think it makes a ton of sense for the Rockies and Angels to be the top two teams that I'm going to target tonight.
Next up, we have got the Giants and the Padres. Garrett Richards going for the Pods. Johnny Cueto on the mound for the Giants.
I don't mind Garrett Richards in this spot. 7,500. Let me see where his he's only projected for 4% ownership. If that ends up holding the case through lock, then I'm going to like Garrett Richards a decent amount. So Richards is a guy who's always been really good when healthy. The issue is that he's almost never healthy, and he's working his way back from what feels like his 8th surgery or something like that. But he's been on limited pitches for most of the season. But last time out, 83 pitches, 9 strikeouts against the A's, so it was in a fairly tough matchup, made it through 7 innings. If he's going to pretty regularly throw, 80 to 90 pitches going forward and be able to work 6 innings or something like that, I think there's a decent amount of upside in Richards. And that's especially true when he's going up against the Giants, who don't have a great offense against right-handed pitching. And also that only 7,500 for Richards. So if he's a guy who's really going overlooked, and this holds true to where he's only going to be 3% owned coming up to lock, then Richards is going to be one of the contrarian pitchers I like for this slate.
Yeah, Richards, $27 over at Yahoo. Of course, they are the sponsor of this show. You got to check out Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports. They do include CSV upload and CSV edit features when you're looking to play those multiple lines, make better choices. Choose Yahoo Daily Fantasy. In terms of the bats on the Padres side, you mentioned about not liking the Giants because of going to right-hand pitcher here. Outside of Fernando Tatis and Manny Machado, what do you like on the Padres?
Yeah, it's hard to really find individual guys I like just because they've been so ridiculously good lately. Like they've scored like double-digit runs in what feels like every other night for the last 3 weeks. So they're pretty expensive outside of those guys, and there's other spots I prefer to pay up. Like peripheral bats for the Padres are more expensive than the peripheral bats for the Angels or for the Rockies. So I think it makes more sense to go to some of those guys, like a David Dahl or Raimel Tapia. those bats to me just make for better value plays than guys like Will Myers or Jay Cronenworth, who are slightly more expensive and just in a tougher matchup and obviously not playing at Coors Field.
Final game of the night is going to be the Mariners and the Diamondbacks. This is one that me and Adam last night spent a little bit of time on in terms of the pitching matchup, because kind of feeling like both these pitchers could be popular pitchers, both value options when you're looking to save some money in terms of salary relief. Caleb Smith getting the debut for the Diamondbacks after his COVID issues, and of course Kikuchi. We've talked about him. There's value on both sides of this equation in terms of pitching and salary.
Yeah, for sure. I find it really odd that Kikuchi's only projected for 3% ownership right now. Like, there's just no way that's going to be the case later in the day. There's a Coors Field game. People are going to be looking for value. And Kikuchi, if I remember correctly, his last start against the Rangers, he was pretty popular that slate. So I assume that's going to be the case again. Kikuchi's overall numbers for this year aren't overwhelming. However, you look at the peripheral stats, and they're really, really strong. Kikuchi does a 5.23 ERA, but a 2.79 FIP, a 3.09 xFIP. He's striking out 9.87 hitters per 9 innings. So the reason that his ERA is so much higher than the peripheral stats, 55% left on base percentage. That is definitely going to go down. Kikuchi changed his delivery in the offseason, and it's had a massive impact. If you look at his velocity numbers, it's like it's a different pitcher. His velocity is so far increased over what it was a year ago. He's gone from throwing 92 miles per hour with his fastball to 95 miles per hour. And then you look at all his breaking pitches also, and all of those are up like 4 to 5 miles per hour from last year also. So Kikuchi, I think any of his numbers from last year where he gave up 1 million home runs and basically couldn't get anybody out, throw those in the garbage. He's a totally different pitcher, way more strikeouts now, walks are down. He looks like a really legitimate, like, top-end starting pitcher in baseball. And really the other reason that his ERA is a little bit inflated, he's also had really difficult matchups. Like, he's pitched against the Dodgers, he's pitched against the A's. This is not nearly a difficult matchup. The Diamondbacks have one of the worst offenses in baseball. So Kikuchi at 6,200 per dollar is my favorite pitcher on the slate.
I can see both of these pitchers being a popular SP2 when you're looking to take up, Lucas or Shane or, one of those guys. To me, I think the ownership's going to be fairly significant on both these guys. And look, I mean, and if you wanted to take two cheaper pitchers today, take one of these guys. I would probably favor Kikuchi more than I would Caleb in this spot. But if you wanted to take, say, one of these guys, and let's say you wanted to take, maybe it's like a Garrett Richards at 7,500. Go load up on your Rockies and Angel stacks.
Yeah, for sure. And I agree with you. I prefer Kikuchi to Caleb Smith. Here's the issue with Smith. Like you mentioned, coming off the COVID suspension, so he hasn't made a start since July 25th, and he only threw 70 pitches in that start. So I have pretty big concerns about his workload tonight, and I don't really think there's a way we're going to know how many pitches he's going to throw until he comes out of the game, and they'll be like, oh, this is how many pitches he has. And it wouldn't surprise me either way. If Caleb Smith throws 90 pitches, I wouldn't be surprised. If he throws 50 pitches, I wouldn't really be surprised by that either. So I'm going to have Caleb Smith in my player pool because of the upside. It's a plus matchup. He's only 5,900. And he's somebody in the past who's been a good fantasy pitcher, even though he's given up runs at times. I mean, for the Marlins last year, 9.86 strikeouts per 9 innings. 2 years ago, 10.24 strikeouts per 9 innings. So if he's somebody who's on and he's going to get a full workload, then he's just way too cheap in this matchup at 5,900. The question is just he comes with the risk of he hasn't pitched in, almost 2 months, and he's coming off a COVID suspension, or whatever we're going to call it, COVID injury list designation. It adds a lot of uncertainty, right? There's a lot of question marks here we don't know, and hopefully some news comes out about his pitch count later in the day that'll make it a little clearer for us. If not, I'm going to say I'll probably have like 15 to 20% exposure to him, and then I'll adjust that up or down depending on how confident I am in his pitch count later in the day.
One of the comments we got is from 3 Run Shot. He says, Seattle, Arizona game stack for the leverage play.
Let's see. What do some of the projection numbers look like?
So looking at our top stack tool, Arizona ownership-wise, they would be the 4th highest.
So not really a lot of leverage then if they're expected to be really chalky. I just think Kikuchi is really good. So I don't want to stack against him, and the public sentiment doesn't seem to quite be there yet with Kikuchi with how good he might be. So if I'm going to make one stack it from this game, I prefer the Mariners side just because we have those question marks about Caleb Smith, right? So it's been so long since he pitched. We don't know what his pitch count's going to be. He could look good. He could look bad. There's no way. No, we haven't seen him pitch in a major league game for 2 months. So just because of that, with the unknown factor, I think that the Mariners make a little bit more sense than the Diamondback side of the game, because Caleb Smith, he could be good tonight. He could be bad. But something has to give, because the Mariners also don't really have a particularly great offense. And either they're going to hit or Caleb Smith's going to shut them down. And I think a lot of it's going to come to just what form Smith's in after the long layoff.
And we should note the price difference for Kikuchi on DraftKings as opposed to FanDuel. FanDuel, he's $7,900 as opposed to $6,200 on DraftKings.
And even the $7,900 price tag, I mean, I don't think we need to consider him on FanDuel just because we only need to roster one pitcher. And there's a lot of high-end pitchers that are worth considering on FanDuel. But even at $7,900, I don't think that's a terrible price tag for Kikuchi. Like, if he was $7,900 on DraftKings, I would still love him at that salary.
So outside of Kikuchi, who do you like as a value pitcher today? If he's number one, who's number two for you?
I mean, Caleb Smith, I think, is an okay option. I like Garrett Richards at $7,500. That's probably the guy who overall is going to be my number two. Richards has just always been a guy who I've liked his stuff and I've liked his upside a lot. It's just that he's hurt so often, but since he pitched really well last start and it seemed like the pitch restriction was off, he made it through 7 innings against the A's in a tough matchup. I think that he makes sense going up against the Giants.
Is Castillo the pitcher you would say, like, you know, he's just a guy just would be the number one overpriced option today?
Let's see well, the most overpriced has to be Adam Wainwright at $8,800. Castillo, amongst guys who I think would be worth considering, is the one who he's the one worth considering that's the worst option, if that makes sense. Like, if I look at the high end guys and it's like, all right, I'm gonna have Bieber, Giolito, Castillo, and who did I miss out? And so it's Bieber, Giolito, Castillo, and Maeda. If I'm going to have those 4 guys in my player pool on the high end, I think that Castillo makes the least sense of those options.
You know, looking at some high ownership of value bets tonight, we mentioned about, David Dowell. Matt Theis also in that game for the Angels, 2,700, third base and outfield. Eligibility, Justin Upton, 2,900, another value bet. Dalton, the catcher for the D-backs, 22% ownership. Is there some value bets that maybe is not high ownership that, you know, you're kind of trying to see how it plays out throughout the day?
Let's see. Let me bring up some of the ownership right now just so I have a better idea, because it's hard to sometimes know all there's so many hitters, it's hard to always be up to date with all the ownership for all of them. That and the ownership came out like 3 minutes before we started the show. So let's see. Bringing him up. Also, I think if we're looking just for pure leverage, I mean, we talked about how if Caleb Smith's actually going to be chalky and we have all this uncertainty about him, I think Dylan Moore at 3,600, Ty France at 3,800. Those are a couple of individual bats for the Mariners that I think make some sense for leverage. Mm-hmm. All right, I have the ownership up now. So it's kind of surprising how popular Ohtani's expected to be tonight. He's expected to be the second highest owned hitter on the slate behind David Dowell. I mean, it makes some sense, but still 4,400 for Ohtani. It's not like he's been that good on offense this year. I think there are some other cheaper bats relative to price that I like a little bit more on the Angels side of the game. I think Luis Torren, if he's going to start a catcher for the Mariners, that's another one who I think just makes for a decent amount of leverage in that spot if Caleb Smith's going to be popular. I think that is the team that makes us the best leverage stack overall is the Mariners. And yeah, I think that's it. Those are the guys I'll be looking at.
And of course, don't forget, come up here today at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. It will be MLB Live Before Lock. I'll be joined by Jeff and Terry to break it down for leading you up to the main slate at 8:05 Eastern Time. Of course, we got a ton of shows today here at Awesemo.com. We got NFL shows, NBA Live Before Lock. So keep it here locked all day long to help you out, build those lineups, and help you win some money tonight. And of course, be sure to sign up for a weekly pass over at Awesemo.com, Awesemo.com/join to sign up for an MLB weekly pass for $15.95. So that's going to do it for this edition of the MLB Strategy Show right here on Awesemo.com.